that they can, at the end of this film, think about, well, what are the cycles in their life that they are ready to break? What are the things they've been carrying that maybe they...
What was intended to come across as a justified and emotional appeal instead struck many as calculated, harsh, and ultimately counterproductive. The initial request itself set a controversial tone, with critics describing it as both unreasonable and cold-hearted. At the heart of the dispute was the assertion that the film had been unjustly taken away from Justin Baldoni in his role as director and removed from the creative control of Wayfarer Studios. This, according to the narrative being pushed, was the result of alleged pressure or leverage exerted by Blake Lively. However, rather than generating sympathy, these claims quickly sparked skepticism within industry circles. Inside Sony, reactions were reportedly far from supportive. Executives were said to be stunned not by the severity of the accusations, but by the way the situation unfolded. Internal responses suggested confusion, disbelief, and even frustration, with some viewing the entire episode as an avoidable and self-inflicted crisis. What was meant to shift the narrative in her favor instead appeared to reinforce doubts, with some insiders characterizing the move as a significant miscalculation. The turning point came with the unsealing of Blake Lively's letter, a document that was clearly intended to serve as a cornerstone of her defense. Rather than exposing external wrongdoing or validating her claims of mistreatment, the letter had the opposite effect. It didn't read like the account of someone sidelined or powerless. Instead, it presented a detailed record of extensive involvement in the filmmaking process. Because it was her own signed testimony, its impact carried far more weight than any external allegation or leaked communication ever could. What made the situation particularly damaging was the level of detail contained within the letter. It outlined participation in development decisions, influence over casting choices, involvement in script revisions, and engagement with production design. It went further, describing input on scheduling, oversight during post-production, and even participation in marketing strategies and distribution discussions. Taken together, these claims painted a picture not of exclusion, but of deep and consistent authority across multiple departments. This created a fundamental contradiction that became impossible to ignore. On one hand, she claimed to have been marginalized, stripped of influence, and pushed aside during key decisions. On the other hand, her own account described a role that extended into nearly every layer of the production. For industry professionals reviewing the situation, this inconsistency raised serious questions. It challenged the credibility of the narrative and made it difficult to reconcile the image of powerlessness with the reality of such extensive involvement. As the situation unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the issue was not simply about conflicting accounts between different parties. Instead, it was about the internal inconsistency within a single narrative. Each additional detail in the letter, rather than strengthening her position, appeared to weaken it further. What may have been intended as transparency instead came across as overexposure, revealing more than it clarified. Behind closed doors, the tone within Sony reportedly reflected irritation rather than intimidation. Executives did not appear to feel pressured or coerced. Instead, they were said to be grappling with what they viewed as a confusing and unnecessarily complicated situation. While public-facing statements remained carefully measured and professional, internal discussions painted a picture of a team trying to understand how the narrative had become so tangled. In the broader Hollywood landscape, the ripple effects were significant. The letter quickly became a focal point of discussion, not because it proved the claims it set out to support, but because it seemed to undermine them. Industry observers noted how rare it is for a single document to so dramatically shift the perception of a case. Rather than building momentum, it stalled at turning what might have been a strategic move into a critical turning point. Ultimately, the situation evolved into a case study in how messaging can backfire when not aligned with the facts being presented. The narrative didn't simply weaken under scrutiny and unraveled. What was meant to serve as a defense became a liability, and what was intended to restore credibility instead raised deeper questions. In the end, the weight of the contradictions proved too significant to ignore, leaving a lasting impact not just on the case itself, but on how it was perceived across the industry. Internally, the reaction was strikingly direct. The prevailing sentiment suggested that the situation had been self-inflicted, that the escalation, the pressure, and the attempt to influence key decisions had only made matters worse. Within Sony, the tone reportedly wasn't one of fear or caution, but of disbelief. Executives didn't appear intimidated. Instead, they seemed confused by how far things had gone. There was a sense that had the situation not been pushed to this level, it might never have spiraled into such a public and damaging conflict. That perception only intensified with one of the most controversial lines attributed to Blake Lively. "I did everything." What may have been intended as a strong declaration of contribution instead landed as a critical misstep, rather than reinforcing her importance to the project. It appeared to contradict the central claim that she had been sidelined or excluded. In a case built on the idea of diminished authority, such a statement carried significant implications. The details provided in her letter further complicated the narrative. She described being deeply involved long before filming even began, participating in early development decisions, influencing location changes, selecting key team members, and helping shape the creative direction of the project. Her account included reviewing casting tapes, contributing to hiring choices, and playing a role in defining the tone and structure of the film. These are not minor contributions. They reflect a level of influence typically associated with high-level creative leadership. As production moved forward, her described involvement only expanded. She outlined participation in script rewrites, input on dialogue and scenes, and an active role in managing on-set dynamics, coordination across departments, communication with crew members, and engagement in decision-making processes were all part of the picture she painted. Rather than appearing detached or marginalized, her account suggested someone embedded in the core operations of the production. This level of engagement began to resemble the responsibilities of a producer or executive rather than an actor operating under limited authority. For many observers, this distinction became central. The more extensive her described involvement, the harder it became to align that reality with claims of being pushed aside. The narrative tension between exclusion and control became increasingly difficult to reconcile. Her influence, according to the same account, extended well beyond the production phase and into marketing and distribution. She referenced involvement in shaping trailers, approving promotional copy, contributing to release strategies, and influencing branding decisions. These are areas typically handled by studios and marketing teams. Yet her descriptions suggested a hands-on role even in these domains. All of this raised a fundamental question. How could someone so deeply involved across development, production, and marketing simultaneously argue that they were excluded from meaningful participation? The contradiction didn't just weaken the argument, it reframed it. What was intended to demonstrate dedication and contribution instead introduced doubt about the consistency of the overall claim. In the end, the issue wasn't simply about how much she contributed, but how those contributions aligned with the narrative being presented. Each additional detail added weight, but not necessarily in the intended direction. Instead of reinforcing her position, the cumulative effect of these statements made the situation more complex, and for many, more difficult to accept at face value.